That was a little awkward. My phone was ringing. It's still ringing. I'm not going to bother turning it off right now, but let's get started. So we're going to discuss open source licensing today. And let me introduce myself. You guys might be like, who's this person? I'm Priyanka Sharma, and I serve as Director of Technical Evangelism at a company called GitLab. GitLab is a single application for the entire DevOps lifecycle, and now also DevSecOps. That's the latest. I'm really excited to moderate this panel today. We have some open source stalwarts here, and I think that's super cool. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a little bit of housekeeping, then I'll introduce the panel, what the topic is, all of that, and then these folks will introduce themselves, and we'll get into the questions. And I think it'll be interesting. So let's see here. All right, so housekeeping-wise, there is a Slack channel where people can submit all of their questions. So you just go to grafana.slack.com, and I think it's gcon-main channel. You can also ask questions live later. We'll get to all the audience questions in the end, so just hang tight. And there'll be at least 10 minutes of that, so that should be good. And then, yep, OK. So this panel, what is it about? So why are we here today? I mean, if you think about it, all of you folks came to GrafanaCon because it's a project you love, a company whose offerings that you support, use, all of that. Now, there's been a lot of spirited conversations by companies that are like Grafana, which are based on open source projects. And those are around open source licensing. So examples for that would be Mongo, Confluent, Redis, et cetera. Some of these folks introduced what are called non-compete licenses. So just in general, did folks see that, the latest news on non-compete licenses? Raise your hands so I know you're listening. OK. Some of you, that's good. How many of you are familiar with just these debates in general and care about open source licensing? OK, great. I hope it's almost all of you, because that's what this panel is about. But it's OK. Even if you have just a beginner's information, we're going to get into details here. That's what this panel is about. So just a quick gut check on our space. Infrastructure projects tend to be open source, and that's what companies depend on. Now, the companies that build on top of these open source projects, like Grafana, Cloudera, GitLab, Percona, Influx, they have their own challenges running businesses. And licensing has been one of the tools that folks are using to build and defend their bottom line. So on this panel, we'll discuss that specific trend and the repercussions of it. And hopefully, everybody will leave with a better idea of what's going on with cloud providers, open source companies, and the end user ecosystem. All right, enough talking from me. Let's get started. Panelists, would you like to introduce yourselves?
I'll go. Joseph Jacks, I'm the founder of OSS Capital. We invest in commercial open source software companies, and happy to be here. Thanks.
Awesome.
I'm Paul Dix. I'm the creator and co-founder and CTO of InfluxDB.
My name is Peter Zaitsev. I run a company called Percona, and all the software we ship is 100% open source.
Hi, everyone. My name's Raj Dutt. I'm the co-founder, one of the co-founders and CEO of Grafana Labs.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'll start with, let's set the stage first. Why don't you folks tell us what keeps you up at night running a company that's based on open source? Paul, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, so, I mean, what keeps me up at night? What competitors are doing, what the cloud vendors are doing, whether or not we can continue to grow our open source community, and also trying to balance that with the closed source software that we develop and making sure that we can continue to grow our business. Yeah, so everything, really. And the zombie apocalypse, worrying about that.
Obviously. What about you?
OK. For us, it is probably slightly different. We are all the software we ship is open source. We are also not a venture-funded company, right? So a lot of choices I think I have done in the past, right? And we had a lot of discussion in the past about what the company should look like, and we have decided to put their open source commitment first, right? And then manage resources what we can invest in building open source software based on what that open source community can provide. That evolved our business model slightly, right? So for example, initially we had been doing just consulting, and that had been very hard to do while investing in open source software. But more recently we started to provide the open source support, and we find that there is a lot of appetite for that across enterprise companies. We just don't want to go with without support whether we run open source software or not.
Yeah, but consulting always starts eating into the startup building time, right?
Yeah, but the thing is, support, wouldn't you have the same problem? Like, isn't it like perverse incentives? Like, if you're monetizing support, then ideally, your ideal customer is somebody who pays you but never files a support ticket, right? So the problem is, like, if your customers are actually getting value out of the service, it means you can't scale your service, or at least your service scales linearly with the number of people you can hire, just like a consulting business.
Yes and no, right? I think a lot of open source support for enterprises, it comes from insurance and assurance. Those people want to have somewhere to call, right? And I would say that if you look at the margins of our support business, they are much more close to the software business, right, and SaaS than to the plain consulting model companies.
Absolutely, makes sense. How do you look at it, Raj? What keeps you up at night?
Oh, what doesn't keep me up at night? I'm an insomniac, basically. So no, but so I guess there's two main things that keep me up at night as far as the business models and open source and whatnot. The first thing is kind of related to what Paul said, balance, right? We're really trying to find the right balance of what we keep open source, what we keep proprietary. We want to grow the community. We also want to create a very valuable open source commercial company, and those odds are, those two things are sometimes at odds. So the balance is really important, and balance kind of is one thing that keeps me up at night. And then I think the other thing that keeps me up at night is, especially because Grafana Labs makes most of our revenue off of cloud, just sort of the existential threat, as it were, that the cloud vendors potentially pose, to companies like Grafana. And we operate with a very big tent mentality, right? We kind of have the attitude that we want to bring different vendors in the ecosystem together. I mean, that's why people like I'm saying the cloud vendors are a potential existential threat, yet we're inviting Google, Amazon, and Microsoft up on stage to talk about all the cool stuff we're doing with us, right? So balance on every level. But the two things are the balance between what we make open source and what we make commercial, and sort of this balance of how we work with the cloud vendors. It's like, I feel at times that it's like walking into like a lion's mouth. So those are the two main things. Yeah,
so along the lines of this balance, do you have a framework you use to decide which goes where?
That's a really good question. So we kind of have a sniff test, as it were, right? So we want to create differentiation on our enterprise product on features that really appeal to the largest companies in the world, right? So if you're a startup, if you're a hobbyist, if you're a home lab user, we don't want to hold anything back. We want you to have access to all the cool stuff that we're doing. But if we kind of choose very, very carefully to hold certain things back that are, again, only the stuff that really appeals to the large enterprises, right? So we have data sources for things like Splunk or New Relic or Datadog or Wavefront or Oracle. And in our view, if you need those data sources, you're kind of self-identifying as an enterprise with potentially more money than time, right? But open source is never free, even to even to small and medium companies, and people are beginning to understand this. Open source is free, like here's a puppy, it's free, right? So I'd say that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, that resonates a lot because we at GitLab, which is also based on an open source project, have landed on buyer-based open core as the model where the pricing depends on who's going to buy it. Is it a manager versus a director versus a CIO, and it goes in an increasing order there. So we've seen the same thing. And the one thing that I think companies have to get comfortable with that kind of attitude, sounds like GitLab similar, is you're only going to monetize a very small percentage of your user base. And that kind of upsets people at times. And I think that's just,
that's the way it is, and that's the dynamics of most open source companies in the history of the world, right?
Yeah.
So
it's working pretty good, so it's all good. JJ, so you come at this, or come on the stage from a different perspective as a VC. So what is your take on biggest challenges for your portfolio companies or other open source commercial companies?
I think these guys covered a lot of the fundamentals. There's a lot of competitive dynamics with the cloud providers building managed services on open source projects that capture a lot of the value that open source ecosystems and projects themselves directly create. There's lots of competitors around open source projects, commercializing, building them. Obviously, Percona is one for MySQL, and MariaDB and others. There's also specific vendors and companies that are commercializing those projects directly. So there's lots of kind of commercialization potential built around open source ecosystems. One of the things that I also kind of lose sleep about a little bit is like the lack of consensus that we have in the industry around what the fundamentals are of commercial open source sort of dynamics. And I think a lot of this was already kind of discussed, but
I mean, I think a lot of that has changed over time, right?
Yep.
Because like the dream in the aughts was you could do open source and you'd make money off of the production tooling, right? Monitoring tools, consulting support, all this kind of stuff. And the reason why the cloud vendors represent such an existential threat is that's how they make their money. They say, we'll take care of that for you. You don't need an ops team. Like, we'll just do it. So then the question becomes for open source vendors, okay, if we can't make money on production tooling, how do we make money? Right.
No, so the cloud vendors are percolating up to the top as one of the top thing that everyone's thinking about on the panel. I'm curious, audience, how many of you folks see options provided by the cloud vendors as competitive to the products on stage here? Well, that's good news for you guys. Was everyone sleeping, or do you actually? Okay, well, that's good. So let's dig deeper into this cloud vendor threat that's at least perceived, if we are to use this audience as a benchmark, if not real. So Peter, what is your thought on this? I heard it from the others, but does it apply to you as well?
Yeah, so I'll make 2 points. First is, I would say, is what we do lose business to Amazon. Right? I mean, there is no question about that, right? So from our standpoint, you can see it as a problem, but I also see that a lot as a hype, because I think what Amazon makes a lot of promises of what they can't keep, right? They say, well, they're giving you a fully managed database like Amazon Aurora. Yeah. It's going to design the schema for you, with you, right, or help you developers to avoid writing crappy code, right? So, of course, it takes away certain low value things like making sure you don't have to fix your replication every night, but that leaves a lot of the higher value activities to be covered for companies like us. And the second, I would say, when we talk about the, let's say, Amazon is bad for open source, I would ask, bad for whom? It is bad for certain companies which are trying to monetize open source, right? And as any company doesn't like the competition, right, and scream fail, but it is very good for users, right? There are so many people who can use now MySQL and especially Postgres, which haven't been able to do that before.
So what if Amazon comes in, they take an open source project, and there's one company that's developing this project, and they build a community around the project, and they pay the developers. Amazon does it, and then they kill this company's business, and then they go out of business, so there are no longer developers committing code to this thing, they're not maintaining it, but Amazon's hosting it. So then at this point, you have a project that's dead.
Well,
right?
I don't think that's exactly what's going to happen, right, in this case. I mean, we don't know what is going to happen exactly, but the companies have been going out of business, right, for forever, right? So if a company goes out of business, if the open source community believes that that open source project is worth maintaining, they will, right?
My point is that somebody has to subsidize the developer's time to develop that code. And the thing is, like, if Amazon's not actually going to contribute back into the project and pay developers to work on it, is it a net benefit for the community for them to offer hosting of that thing? I would argue no. If they are going to pay developers to invest into it and write code, fine, great. The open source company goes out of business, that's their fault, they couldn't figure out how to make money.
Well, but let's say what the open source community, right, in this case, it made a choice to go with open source license that comes with tremendous advantages, right, in terms of adoption. That comes also with tremendous risks for the companies like Amazon, and actually a lot of small companies and individuals can provide alternatives to your service and monetize that. I mean, that is a choice you made, right? And now in a different world, you may regret it. So what?
Of course, yeah, I totally agree with you. But then, I mean, I guess that's really what's driving all of these vendors to pick up basically non-compete licenses.
Oh yeah, that's fine. I mean, I totally get that. That is totally reasonable choice. Then don't call it open source and don't pretend it's open source license.
Right. I totally agree with that.
So non-compete licenses, folks that's one tool in you guys' arsenal, right? To compete.
Not in mine.
One potential.
Not in mine either.
Okay, so I was going to ask you, Raj, have you considered introducing a non-compete license?
Absolutely, we've considered it. We've kind of debated it, at length, right? I mean, when we...
Raj and I have talked about this between each other as well over the years.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a long-running, multi-year conversation, I'd say. And we were really happy several years ago when we got going because we're like, hey, open source. I mean, Mark Andreessen said software is eating the world a long time ago, right? And now open source was eating the software world. Great, good for us. Right. But then, when we see cloud eating open source, we're like, wait a minute, that's not good for us, right? We've been considering it, but we're pretty clear cut at Grafana Labs, where we want to have the large majority of our software and our effort open source under a truly open source license that doesn't get confusing or doesn't have restrictions around use. But we also have some commercial software that is not open source, and we think that's fine. And it's really important to us to be really clear to our community and to our customers what is open source, what is not open source. And I think the pushback you're seeing in the community is when certain vendors try to blur the line and try to have their cake and eat it too. And they claim it's open source, but it's not really open source. And that's what we want to avoid doing at Grafana Labs, at least.
Right, yeah. And we do the same at Influx. Like me from like 3 years ago, I thought open core was a dirty word. Like I hated the idea of it. But at this point, I'm a fan of open core because I think it's much more clear about what's going on. And particularly open core where the open source license is permissive, like MIT or Apache 2. Like, I want my open source software to be free for anybody to use for anything. If they want to use it to make money, great, go for it. If they want to use it to start a new project, go do that. And then for the commercial stuff, I keep the source closed so that it's obviously commercial. There's no confusion about what's open and what's closed. Yeah,
and I completely agree. I think open core is fantastic in terms of that is very clean, very clear. There is no attempted misrepresentation. Right. So that's great.
So am I hearing then open core over non-compete or other similar blurry licenses? That's what you folks are saying.
That's what I'm a fan of.
Yeah. Yes. Basically, don't confuse your community and your customers, basically, and don't try to paint commercial software with an open source brush.
Yeah. So there's also another thing, like, so some people are doing like these source available licenses where it's like a commercial license, but they're putting the source out there. And one thing I haven't seen people talk about that I think is not good is like, I think that's actually a disservice to the community because, for example, if there's an open source project and then the company has a source available license for this other piece of functionality, I as a community member decide, you know what, I'm going to go out and I'm going to start something that competes with what's in their source available license. The company can theoretically sue me because they can claim that I looked at their source code and used it as the basis of my product. Right? Whereas if it's just a closed source commercial license, they can't make that claim.
Yes, and there is even more than that. I've seen companies also publishing that things on the GitHub, right? And that looks exactly the same as open source software. And then some developers, which may not be sophisticated, starting to use that software and then getting in the compliance violation, and then vendors can come to them and make them an offer they cannot refuse.
Yeah, that's the Oracle model.
Careful, Paul. Oracle's a sponsor.
So JJ, do you see innovation get throttled whenever a subsection of open source starts going after these non-compete type licenses?
So I think I'm on the same page with Paul about non-compete licenses being negative value to broader community ecosystem kind of motivations for using software. One of the things that I think these non-compete licenses are fundamentally doing is preventing other constituents or entities from capturing value. So it's about preventing cloud providers from capturing value that an open source project creates through extensions around the open core or plugins or enterprise features or what have you.
Yeah.
And I think that open source is fundamentally about maximizing value creation and sort of disaggregating out value capture across lots of different types of constituents. Whereas with proprietary software, it's about maximizing value capture and in some ways kind of controlling the boundaries of value creation for a select few group of constituents or primarily customers that pay for a license in order to maximize share of value capture. And I think that non-compete licenses serve to sort of devolve open source back to fully proprietary software if they're not constructed in the right way. One thing I think we do need as an industry, though, is a standard common terminology and agreement on when you want to commercialize your open source project and actually sell it to customers with additional features that may be proprietary and value added, or as a service. We need more industry consensus and industry agreement on those types of legal frameworks and those legal agreements so that we can avoid replication of effort and duplication of energy across all these different companies, reinventing new licenses every single time.
Yeah, you've got Snowflake licenses. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
You've got a license for Cockroach Labs. You've got a license for Confluent.
Basically, every one of these commercial open, I call them cost companies, commercial open source software companies, reinvents a new commercial enterprise license for the proprietary extensions or features that wrap around the open core. And most of these licenses aim to solve the same type of problems and constraints around permissiveness of use and indemnification and damages and warranties and so on. And I think we just need more standardization there to prevent basically legal inefficiencies. This is completely distinct from creating a license explicitly for preventing a cloud provider from capturing value. That's a completely separate thing, which I think is a bad sort of progression we're seeing. And one thing I think that I'll actually sort of maybe confrontationally disagree with Raj about is I don't think the cloud is eating open source. I think the open source effort that we're seeing kind of pick up more broadly and exponentially in open source as a whole is eating cloud computing. I think the exact opposite is true, mostly because cloud computing is always going to gravitate towards where the most innovation is, and open source overall has a greater pace and rate of innovation than any cloud provider can deliver to their customers in a centralized way.
So I agree with what you just said, JJ, but then bring it back to what Paul said, which is that's like a temporary phenomena because the innovation is happening because it's truly open source, but once they start, essentially being the existential threat to the open source vendors, it takes the wind out of all that innovation.
Right. Once the VC subsidy dries up.
Exactly.
But I don't agree with. So this is the way I would frame it. If you were to classify two huge buckets, right? On one side, you've got cloud providers with, say, maybe tens of thousands of engineers, and then on another side, you've got another bucket where you've got tens of millions of engineers. And the rate of innovation in pure software output, abstractions, technology, frameworks, applications is orders of magnitude is probably it's certainly orders of magnitude greater than all the engineering output and innovation that cloud providers can wield.
Yeah, but the thing is, a large-scale infrastructure project is developed by a team of like closely knit engineers that are well organized. It's usually not developed by like tens of millions of software developers around the world putting out open source software that's great. But generally, you're talking about a lot of libraries, a lot of one-offs, a lot of small contributions to existing large projects. And the thing is, once a project gets up to a certain size, it becomes a full-time job for multiple people just to manage it, not even to write code, right? All they're doing is like looking at PRs, responding to issues. So ultimately, like I still think like a team of people, like there's going to need, for these large infrastructure projects, you need to have like a financed, well-financed team of people. Where that money comes from, is it VC, is it a successful business model, is it the exhaust from something else, is it a foundation, right?
I think we're starting to see constellations and more coordination of groups of people to actually build large-scale, sustainable, technically deep infrastructure projects in a decentralized open source way, where funding is coming from a variety of sources, partially from venture capital, partially from academia, from large internet companies, from foundations, from other places. And my theory is that there's more innovation there as sort of clusters of grouped coordination kind of propagate by necessity, as opposed to a fully centralized monolithic entity like a Google or an Amazon or Microsoft building kind of proprietary central services. And we're starting to see an effect of shifting to open source based alternatives anyway, because that's kind of where the industry is going. We're seeing Kinesis shift to Kafka. We're seeing RDS shift to more predominant hosted open source based data paths and even application layer middleware things as well.
Yeah. So you're saying clouds shouldn't service wrap open source? Is that
I think clouds that service wrap open source are doing that to respond to where the market is heading and evolving based on where the innovation is.
Right.
So enterprises are always going to adopt the most innovative technology, which is driven by developers dictating that technology to the enterprise.
It's driven by demand. And the thing is, the entire value prop for all of the cloud vendors is we operate this stuff for you.
Right. So. And it's connected to all the other things.
And you don't really care that it's the real open source project is the other thing. I mean, like, look at what Amazon did with their MongoDB offering, right? It's not actually MongoDB, so it's not even service wrapping open source. So I mean, so that's even a weirder situation. I guess the other point, JJ, that I just want to bring up is I agree with what you're saying in terms of if you look at who's funding open source, outside the cloud vendors, it's all sorts of people, right? You have, open source vendors, you have companies, you have, companies funding full-time developers to work on projects. But the reason all this is happening is because people are depending on running that software in production. Like, let's assume that RDS gets to, 100% market share of, MySQL and Postgres, which I don't think they will, but just, bear with me. Then what's the imperative anymore for anyone to work on the open source Postgres or MySQL projects? Like, it'll just, the wind out of both those project sales just gets totally taken out, in my view.
So what's I think people are in violent agreement in some ways here, but what's the solution? We're saying the cloud providers do pose a threat to open source in general, is what I'm hearing here. But we don't want to do non-compete licenses. So how are you guys solving the problem?
If we have the solution, I think we can just retire right now, right?
I have one solution, which is that we need more open source in the world in general. We need more open standardization efforts. We need more open interfaces. We need more open government. We need more open technology platforms. And we need more open up and down the stack, I think. All of the commercialization, economic, business model issues solve themselves over time. I think the biggest fundamental solution, though, is openness is about creating a lot more value than closedness or proprietary-based technology can create. And in a world where there's more abundance and people can be more innovative, more efficient, and do more with less, I think business models eventually take care of themselves.
Well, I think from my side, I think there is this interesting assumption, right? We see certain trends, right? And we see, well, trends continue. Yes, things like a database as a service obviously gained a lot of market share over the last, let's say, 5 years. But from my standpoint, the innovation in open source often takes a lot of time, longer time to come together, right, compared to those, tightly controlled, single component engineering proprietary solutions. But at the same time, they are very much inevitable, right? So, for example, we see now Cloud Computing Foundation coming up. We see their kind of Kubernetes coming up, right, providing us kind of the open source cloud neutral infrastructure. And I believe what we are going to be the solutions like RDS and whatever on this platform.
So I have a theory about the
popping up.
CNCF, about
What's that?
Kubernetes and the CNCF. It was an entire head fake by Google to upend the, like, they're going up against Amazon, the entrenched player in the space. So how do they do it? They commoditize the software platform. And they develop the whole thing internally, and then they open source it, and they tell the Linux Foundation, start a foundation around this.
Yeah. I agree with your conspiracy theory. We've discussed this before. So I guess your point is if Amazon wasn't a threat, Kubernetes would not be open sourced by Google.
Kubernetes wasn't open source by, like,
or
Borg
Google
has
wouldn't be
exist-
driving it as much.
Yeah, Borg has existed for years.
Yeah.
Like, why did they suddenly decide to open source it?
But I do think it has worked well for the general public that has happened. As someone sitting on the Cloud Native Computing Foundation board,
Well, I agree.
I almost feel obligated to say that, but I believe it.
Regardless of the motivations, I agree. The net benefit is,
Yes,
is
exactly.
good, is positive.
Exactly.
Actually, which brings me to one other thing. I just
Yes.
wanted to circle back to the
Yeah.
permissive licenses thing,
Yeah.
because we were all like maligning them.
Yeah.
I don't think they're actually totally negative. Like,
Right.
if you think about it, tons of people can actually still use that software for free, build their businesses, build their livelihoods off of it. So ultimately, like, I think those, like, whatever the restricted licenses
Yeah.
are better, strictly speaking, than maybe closed source software,
Yes.
but at the same time, they just kind of muddy the water.
But don't you think that's a slippery slope? Like you're saying, it's not as bad, right? But I mean, this whole like, yeah, the source is here, but it's not really open source thing. This isn't new. Microsoft did this in the 90s, right? With their whole shared source initiative, right? And so the second people start saying like, oh, the non-compete licenses aren't so bad, it's really just the same as open source. I think that's such a slippery slope that you don't even start walking.
Yeah, I don't think it's the same as open source. I mean, like I said, I have a strong preference for permissive plus obviously closed and clearly communicated, but
I think this is really nuanced, and most people sort of like overlook this. For decades, we've had the software industry where it's really simple. You pay to access the software, and you have to pay someone to like receive value from the software. This is also true with SaaS. Mark Benioff brilliantly said, no software. You're paying for the software, you just happen to be paying for some different unit of measure, and your consumption model is maybe a little bit more efficient. With open source, you have two dimensions to consider in terms of how you consume the software. You have some base, ostensibly fully permissive, but sometimes you have different constraints of permissiveness, open source licensed project, MIT, Apache, GPL, BSD, what have you. And then you have, in many cases, an extension of proprietary features that open core based commercial open source software vendors implement. And that's where we're seeing huge amount of friction. One of the things that I'm really worried about, and that I do somewhat lose sleep over, is the leakage and the sort of poisoning from that top layer of commercial licensing for open source and the base standard industry agreement we've seen around Apache 2.0 and around GPL v3 and things like that. And I think if you start to mix those two worlds, really bad things start to happen.
Yeah. So I want to do a market check here. I'd like to ask people in the audience, how many of you would not want to use a product like Grafana, like GitLab, or Influx, Percona, et cetera, if it used a non-compete license? Okay. I just wanted to do this gut check. Thank you. Thank you for participating. And with that, let's turn it over to questions from the audience. I'm going to try to access the Slack. Give me one sec. They told me to make this movement. It's working. Okay. All right. Sorry, give me a sec. There are questions about Loki here. Maybe, gosh, all right, let's see. I was seeing some really good stuff, but I don't know. This is all Loki. Am I on the right channel? gcon-main? Yes, please. Sorry, guys. We could, if we don't find it, we could do.
While we're getting that sorted, if anyone raises their hands, I'm sure someone can come up with a mic and grab you.
Sorry?
Or I'll personally come down and grab you myself.
Okay.
Stay right there. This is truly interactive.
Playing out Paul's scenario, the cloud company ingests a product, starts offering it as a service, the community dies. What happens when that product is no longer being innovated? Does the cloud, in your mind of how that rolls out, does the cloud company start investing internally in a closed source way in maintaining that to be a competitive service offering?
I mean, I think the cloud company, I think they already do invest in it internally. Like, I think Amazon invests heavily in all of those things internally, but they're keeping all of that code closed, right? I guess like one of the reasons why I prefer very permissive licenses is if that kind of scenario were to play out, then the code that's open source is sitting around waiting for anybody to pick it up and do something that they can do anything they want with it, right? So I think permissive licenses actually give the community more potential outs or more potential options in case the company behind it folds, or the company behind it just becomes evil and they're like, oh, we're taking all our code. Well, they can't do that retroactively for the previous releases, and that's why permissive licenses are so great, because then the community, if the software is good and they like it, they can just say, you know what, we're going to fork it and we'll take it ourselves.
100% agree, and it's the ultimate insurance policy, right? Yeah. And I think you've probably got a really good example about this, Peter, with our sponsors.
Yeah, but what I want to mention in this case, I think you always go to this kind of doom scenario. But remember, if you look at the Amazon, right, they want to maximize the revenue for them. And in this regard, they are looking to have their healthy community about that. Why they offer Amazon RDS for MySQL or Postgres, right, and not some exotic database? Exactly because there is a healthy community, right, in this case. Now, at this point, they don't need to invest in communities because they are still healthy. Now, I believe if Amazon will impact so large that communities will become unhealthy, that will force them to give back more to community for the sake of their own business.
But they're not strictly motivated, right? The reason why they built RDS is because there's a community there and those people want it. The truth is Amazon would probably prefer everybody uses DynamoDB because it's totally proprietary and it's something they own that's differentiated from other cloud vendors. Hosting MySQL is not a differentiated product.
Well, I mean, even in MySQL space, they focus on Aurora, which is differentiated, right? In this case, but they provide MySQL compatibility exactly because there is a lot of community around that.
So I have a good question here that I want to make sure. Sorry, guys. So Matt Persley, says that so it sounds like writing and supporting new open source tools is not as marketable or profitable as providing tools as a service, whether they're open source or proprietary. When cloud providers do that, then why? The question, why is there open source tooling coming up? Why are the projects, why is there more and more open source if it's not so great?
I think that's a really good question. And in my mind, the reason why that is because in the last several years, at least with regards to infrastructure software and data analytics software, I think the ship on that has kind of sailed. And the expectation is that you're gonna need to be open source in order to see adoption. Most enterprises have a very, compared to what they were 10 years ago, progressive open source philosophy. Right. And I think that it's really tough for a new SaaS provider of data processing or analytic services or database as a service to even, get a beachhead in the market because of the overhang of the public cloud providers, right? I mean, they have the ultimate channel to, those kind of services.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's a really good comment here by Gene Liverman that cloud vendors don't contribute back proportional to what they consume. And they continue to say that's a fair reason why the Linux Foundation has the core infrastructure initiative. Do folks agree that the vendors don't contribute as much as they consume?
I think Doug Cutting, who's the creator of Hadoop, Nutch, and Lucene. So Lucene is the basis for Elasticsearch, and Hadoop is a really successful big data project. Actually said something exactly in line with that comment, but very different. And he tweeted this, so maybe I'll tweet this out a little bit later, but he said that it is insane to expect that consumers of open source contribute back to it proportional to the value that they received. And I'm paraphrasing very slightly, but I think that's almost exactly what he said. And I very strongly agree with that, mostly because of the sort of tenets of open source fundamentally being about permissiveness. And if we have permissiveness as a fundamental primitive for open source, it is fundamentally, kind of unjustified to demand or expect the consumer to contribute back in any way proportional to the value that they receive from it. And I think that's just fundamentally the way it is and should be acceptable and shouldn't change.
Yeah, by design, consumers of open source should get more value out of it than they put in.
So,
right?
Sorry. I'd like to end the panel with one last question, which is, actually to the audience. So Elizabeth B. said a really important point. It's like, why not have a user who's decided to go use an open source offering rather than a paid I think, if I understand this question correctly, the question is, if there's someone in the audience who's chosen one of these options over a cloud provider service wrapped option, like if they could share why, that'd be really interesting. And we can end the panel with that. Is there anyone here? Maybe you chose Percona over Aurora, I think?
Yeah.
Or anything like that. Someone in the, okay, there's, can we offer the mic, please? Over there, right? Thank you so much. That would be interesting to mix it up.
Yes. Wow.
Right. Let's end on a happy note.
Testing. There it is. We choose a lot of software that is available through cloud providers, and we go with the open source software because we want to avoid vendor lock-in. We don't want to get stuck with one provider. Does that answer it?
Yeah. That makes sense. All right. Well, with that, thank you so much to the panelists for joining us here and sharing your thoughts on open source licensing. Thank you for the audience for staying engaged, answering my questions. I really appreciate it. And with that, let's give a hand of applause.
Thank you.